All right, thank you, Kelsey. So my name is Natalie Bennon. I currently am the Associate Director of Public Relations at Gard Communications, and I've been working with COLT for about 5 years now, or COLT and the watershed councils and the conservation districts through the Oregon Conservation Partnership to help publicize stories that you want to get out to a broader audience, mostly through news media. But recently we thought that it might be useful to present on how to write a strategic communications plan, especially for many of you who aren't, some of you are communicators by training and some of you are communicators because it's just part of your job, but maybe you don't have formal training on how to do it. So maybe this will help give a little bit of structure to why you're communicating, who you're communicating to, what you're trying to say, and some focus and planning to your efforts. Thank you, Noreen. So the introduction, are you communicating without a strategy? Or maybe the strategy is just in your head. Are you not sure what to say or when to say it? It can be really helpful to have a plan, and it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be time consuming. It can be very simple, but it can be really helpful to have something that's thought out and research-based. Next, thanks.
So going into research, all great plans start with this, and you don't have to have a really expensive budget to do so. It can be with just interviewing folks that are around, either staff members, employees, volunteers. Also, online surveys are really helpful and saves time as well if you don't want to go and individually interview folks. Internet research, there's a lot of studies that you can reference and look at, and also looking at your own analytical data. So if you're looking at, like, you have your Google Data Studio, you could look at that. You could check your Facebook metrics, Instagram, Twitter, any resource that you have. They can all be helpful for determining demographics, just your market and how people engage with you. And if you have a larger budget, you could definitely have a more robust survey and have a specialist help you do so, and just send out that survey to other folks that might not be in your direct network. And after you've collected your data, it's like, now what do you do with this? And you can start breaking it down. So one way I really,
Noreen, I'm sorry. I just wanted to let people know if they have a question, maybe just do the raise hand thing, and also we'll save time for bigger questions at the end.
Yeah, there'll definitely be time for Q&A and more discussion at the end. Sweet. So yeah, one way that I, being a marketing communication mind, I always like to break down things in SWOT analysis. And so as you look at your data, break it down into 4 categories of strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so this is a great way to look at what you currently have and what you can improve upon and where you can grow. So if you have great opportunities for taking photos at your event, what can you do with those photos? Or if you could definitely post it to social media, you could send it to reporters. And a lot of times folks like to have photos with their stories because it helps paint a bigger picture. If you're skilled in grant writing or have great writers, then utilize that. That'd be awesome to use for drafting your communication plan, sending out messages, writing press releases, social media copy. So it's really easy to break up what you have in this kind of order. And I feel like it helps my mind, especially because I'm able to look at everything, and it helps me. If I look at the strengths and weaknesses, then I know the weaknesses can be turned into opportunities, and strengths can also keep in mind about how you combat your threats. And then going forward, after you've figured out your SWOT analysis, it's great to look at your goals. And this can be about 1 to 3 goals. They don't have to be too extensive, and like you can definitely adjust them. So whether you want to increase awareness, you want to increase donations, if you're trying to be more involved in government relations, so if you're trying to pass certain legislation, it's good to map these out as you're planning your communications plan. And then after you've considered your goals, how are you going to measure this? So kind of like a SMART goal now. So I think it can be interchanged with objectives, and thinking about, okay, is it attainable? Is it how are you going to measure this? In what time? And they're definitely adjustable. You don't have to have it set in stone. It's going to be the same. They can adjust as you see results come out, or if you just feel that you set too lofty of a goal, if 20% for social media was too much, then maybe you can scale it down to 10%. So it's definitely good to add a bit of timeliness and measuring capability to your goals so that you know that you can achieve it and how you're going to do so. And after looking at, this is where a lot of the research data comes in, where I was mentioning with like social media and checking out your analytics or metrics. It's like, who are you trying to reach? So knowing your demographic and your audiences. So it's okay to have multiple audiences, because then you know who you're reaching out to, but also then you know which messages to cater for each. So if you're having a group of younger folks who are fresh out of college, you want to reach them probably maybe through social media. But then if you have older folks, how are you going to reach them? Is it an email newsletter? Is it having in-person meetings? And one fun thing, as I've shown an example here, is that you can create these personas, and you can go as wild with it if you want, with putting an image, giving personality traits, but it kind of helps you like personify who you're reaching out to, and can help you like, okay, cool. For this message, we're going to reach out to college grad Carrie, and next one, we're going to reach out to senior Sam. And so you can definitely change it up, and try not to have too many target audiences, because then it can be very hard to make sure that you're having a clear and concise message throughout all of them. And then, as we're saying, like making sure you have a key message. So what are you trying to communicate, and what are the main topics? So a lot of times there's many ideas that you might have. So it's good to have a long version, about 1 page, break everything down and say like, this is what I want folks to know. And then start scaling it back, going into a medium version, a short version, and whittling it all the way down to being about 1 sentence. So that's really great. And then you can keep that one-liner phrase in the back of your mind as you're going forward. But then if you need to expand upon the details, you have these other 3 documents to help you as well. And I will pass it off to Natalie to discuss more about strategy.
Thanks, Noreen. So does anyone have any immediate questions we should turn to, or just keep going? Okay, I'm going to keep going, but do raise your hand if you want us to pause for a minute on anything. Strategy. So I think strategy is sometimes the hardest part of this. You know, it's a vague term. What does it mean to, I mean, the strategies can be really variable depending on your audience and the research you found. But every time I've done this process, I've found that if I just trust the process, do a little bit of research, think about my audiences, think about what I want to say, all of a sudden I get to the strategy section and it starts to make sense. It starts to just things fall into place. And the SWOT analysis really helps too, because you see, you know, what are your strengths, and you can leverage those. You can think about whether you need to address weaknesses, that sort of thing. So everything you do beforehand will feed into what ends up being your strategy. That said, that second bullet there, not done yet, sorry. That second bullet there, lead with your stories, is I think a good fallback strategy, if you will, if you're not really sure what all this research was saying, or how you can be strategic in applying everything you've done to this point. I think a good fallback strategy is to lead with your stories. So what does that mean? That means that you're looking at your organization and keeping an eye out, and also specifically asking for and encouraging people to tell you the stories that are, they can be positive, they can be negative, they can be learning experiences, they can be, ideally there is a people element to them. And then you decide, what am I going to do with that story? You'll find later later in the process which communications vehicles are going to work for you. But if you've decided, you know, that you really want to leverage some sort of email newsletter, then that would be the main place you might tell that story. Could also be that it's a really quick story. It's just a photo and a quick sentence that you post on social media. But you get the stories, and then you decide, where are the places I want to tell them? Do I want to tell them to the news? Do I want to put it on social? Do I want to put it on a website? Is it an email? Is it a donor communication? you just, sort of tick the boxes or go through the boxes and tick off the ones that make sense for that and the ones you have time for. So next slide, thanks. So once you decide on your strategy, you can consider your tactics. And I like to think of tactics under this PESO model, which is paid, earned, social, and owned. It's not a perfect model. It doesn't get everything, but you can go to the next slide, that's fine. But it does give you a good sense of the options you have. So paid media is anything, it sounds like what it is, anything you pay for. There's overlap with social media. Social media is the same as shared there. There's overlap with other buckets, but paid media can be advertising in a newspaper. It can be banner ads on a website. It can be Google AdWords, which maybe some of you have used because I know they sometimes offer free accounts for nonprofits. It can be a social media ad, but anything that you're spending money on, which I know is not going to be very often because most of you don't have a budget for that, which is fine. Earned media is anything that you convince somebody to communicate on their own platform. So this is largely news media. If you've convinced a journalist to write a story in their newspaper or on their website about your project, that's earned media. Shared media, also social, is anything that is social in nature, shared in nature. So social media channels are the main one, but it can also be word of mouth. If a landowner tells their neighbor that they worked with this conservation district on this great project, that's word of mouth, and that's kind of that's a valuable social communication. And then owned means anything you own and have control over. So that would be your website or any newsletters that you send out by print or email or anything like that. Next slide, thank you. There are a couple other tactics to consider sometimes that don't fall neatly in those PESO buckets. In-person meetings or speeches can be really valuable for specific audiences. Events can be really valuable. Maybe that goes under shared or social, I'm not sure, but events can be a really valuable communications vehicle for reaching new people or reaching your target audience. Thought leadership, this is something that touches a lot of different buckets, but it's just the idea that your organization has a unique perspective to share, and figuring out what that leadership role is in the news or online, and leveraging those to present your unique perspective and your unique value is thought leadership. And then also printed materials and handouts, brochures, that sort of thing. So here's an example of once you, and we're going to send a template with some of these instructions, but once you fill out your SWOT analysis and your audiences and your strategy, you will come to a section of tactics, and you'll have to decide what are all the tactics. I like to consider the whole enchilada. What are all the tactics that I could think about? Do I want to do social media? Do I need to do social media? Do I need to do all the channels? What are the ones that make sense and that my audience is most active on? What are the ones I can maintain? Because if you can't maintain content on 4 different channels, you shouldn't bother. So a lot of organizations are on Facebook because it is a really general, basic platform that reaches a wide audience. So your actions under that might be that you want to post twice weekly, or maybe it's 3 times, or maybe it's once. Whatever you choose, just try to be consistent. And then what are the possible content ideas you have for Facebook? Are you going to post photos or videos of projects? Are you going to post articles? Are you going to post about events, either upcoming events or events that have already happened? Are you going to share partner posts? Are you going to share announcements of funding or grants or new projects? Are you going to share about staff? There are lots of ideas, and you can get ideas by looking at other organizations' social media accounts. But by having a sense of what are the content buckets you can fill beforehand, then you can start to build out a calendar of how to fill that without having to think about it every day or every week. Another example is of a tactic is news media. If you decide that the news media really is an important vehicle to reach your audience in your community, then you'll want to start developing relationships with local journalists at those outlets. You'll want to determine how to share stories with journalists, and the relationship will help you understand what they need and when they need it. But do you want to send them an invite to an event or to a project? Do you want to write a press release? Do you want to write a quick email? I think that the one thing I notice with people who haven't done this yet is that they don't realize that sending out a press release a week after your project is finished is not very valuable for the news media. It's sort of old by then. So thinking about getting started earlier is valuable, and developing at least a cursory relationship with the journalists that you think are going to be influential for your audience is also valuable, so you can get a sense of what they need and when they need it. Okay, I'm doing budget. How much money and time will you need for these strategies and tactics? I think most of your organizations, my experience is that you're not going to spend money on social media ads and that sort of thing, or if you do, it'll be limited, and that's absolutely fine. But time is also part of your budget. So do you have a person who can spend, an hour a week on this? Do you have board members that can help? Do you have volunteers who can help? Just thinking about the time budget is also important here. And I see a question in the chat. Yes, we are going to send you a template after the webinar.
So now that you have your content and more of your communication ideas, now you need to figure out when you're going to send it out and when you have the time to do so. So it's really great to start calendaring, because then you can see where you can fit things in, whether if you're wanting to send out, as Natalie was mentioning, like, oh, if there's an event going on, we want to send out a press release. So if we want to reach out to media beforehand, how long will it take them to come to this event? Maybe we want to reach out 2 weeks in advance and then do some follow-ups then. And this really helps you figure out if you've taken on too much, if you need to share the load with somebody else, if you need to take out items, and really focus on what's important. And that's also really key on figuring out, again, prioritizing your goals. And if you want to post on social media, if you want to post every day, but then you start realizing hey, every day is a lot because I have to spend X amount of hours creating content. So maybe you want to scale it back to 2 or 3 days. So it's really great to start calendaring and figuring out what works best for you and what works best with your resources and budget. And then not only are you calendaring what you're going to be sending out, but then also how are you going to measure your results and when? So do you want to have a monthly check-in to see how things are doing, quarterly, annually? At the minimum, I would say annually is the best, because then you can just reflect back on the last year and see what worked well, what didn't work well, and then move forward. But then it's also really great to schedule time for story mining, which means sitting down with executives, folks in your organization, and saying, hey, what's going on in your area? What's going on in your field? What's going on with you? Because a lot of times I've noticed with some of our clients or organizations we work with, they're like, oh yeah, we have this cool event happening, but I can just send you some photos afterwards. I'm like, no. Tell me about this ahead of time. We definitely want to send this to news media beforehand. We can definitely, if you have photos, we can use that for follow-up. We can also use that for social media. This is a great thing. Even if you feel it's small, and I feel a lot of people feel oh, we're just in our own lane focused on this. So they might not be thinking hey, this is a great communications plan. So it's good to reach out to individuals to make sure and see what they're up to, and making sure that they're staying in the loop and they're keeping in touch with you about what's happening, because a lot of these stories can be used for social media content or communications or sending out to media. And then, as I was mentioning about making sure to measure results, we definitely want to look into how you're going to evaluate what has been done and how are you going to measure it. So after we've already hopefully had objectives that are measurable and attainable, or at least like in a certain time frame, you can gauge this. So you would like to check in and see like when you want to report on this. So whether it's monthly, quarterly, annually, and looking at it, seeing the results, seeing if it was a feasible goal to have, and then as well as what you're going to do going forward. So if you want to make adjustments, how you're going to report this as well. So it's really crucial to see, and I think even before how, you want to know who you're reporting this to. So again, audience, but even internally, are you just reporting this to the whole organization? Are you reporting this to certain execs, decision makers? And after you know who, then you'll know how to format it. So whether it's an Excel sheet, a quick meeting with a Word document with overviews, a PowerPoint presentation I've found is really helpful just to help people break down the data so you can see, hey, we had in December this many followers, and now we have this many people on our newsletter or this many people on social media. And as you look at your results and present them, you want to think about how you're going to make these adjustments going forward. So if you realize that your goals were too big, how are you going to adjust it going forward, that you want to scale it back? Or if you felt that they were really attainable and you were able to accomplish them in the first month or few weeks, how are you going to make it so that you want to improve? So it's really great to have these check-in points as well as knowing how you're going to evaluate. And also, I think a key point that like Natalie and I have had a mistake, remember how you're going to measure your objectives and evaluate, because a lot of times we say like, okay, here's a report for this month or this year. And then we touch back on it in a few weeks. We're like, how did we get that number? I do not remember that. So you definitely want to write down your process, not only just the results, but how you got the results, because math can be tricky for a lot of folks and definitely a pain at times.
All right, this is the last slide. I just want to encourage everybody to start small. You can think big. You know, I don't know if any of you use that big, hairy, audacious goal acronym sometimes. You can think big and you can plan big, but you don't have to implement everything, right? So start at what seems feasible. Anything you do that's consistent will yield results as long as it's targeted at the people you want to reach and you're saying what you want to say and that you thought about all these things beforehand in a sort of coordinated way. So really prioritize and don't be intimidated. All right, that went quickly. We probably talked too fast. But there's lots of times for conversation and there's lots of time for conversation and questions. And we will have a template to share with you afterwards. Has anyone here ever done any communications planning before? Have they done it similarly to this or differently? What would I say is the biggest, there's a question in the chat, what would I say is the biggest piece of the puzzle that people miss? Probably the research. I think that people assume that research is expensive, that research requires contractors and, you know, surveys and things like that. And that's great if you do have the budget for that. But research for communications planning can be really low budget. It can be simply interviewing your board members, asking them a series of questions. It can be interviewing some of the, you know, if you have a focus on reaching landowners, for example, maybe it's interviewing landowners who have been part of your process, landowners who are currently part of your process, maybe a few landowners that you're interested in reaching, if you can get them to talk to you, and asking them, you know, how did you hear about us? What do you know about us? That sort of thing. So that's very low budget. It's not quantitative, right? It's qualitative research, but it's still valuable. Looking at other organizations and how they use their social media, getting on their newsletters and seeing what kinds of things they put on their newsletter, checking out their websites, talking to whoever does their communications. That is also a lot of really good qualitative research that can help inform a plan.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah. A question from Charlotte.
Hi, yeah. I wanted to ask whether you have any tips and tricks that you use for kind of reining in scope, specifically related to audience. I feel like we kind of have been tasked with like reach everyone in the county we serve. We can do some prioritization around audience types, but in the end, we are still kind of directed to just like reach everyone, make sure everyone knows about us, which can be very, very difficult. So what tips do you have or what tricks do you use when you're trying to whittle down audiences or scopes?
I think that's a really great question. And my question back to another person would be, okay, we can have that sort of like bottom layer of, okay, we're going to try to reach everybody in the county, but when you reach them, what do you want them to do? So if you know what you want them to do, then you might filter up to a subset of people where everybody in the county probably doesn't own land, for example. If you want landowners to do something specifically, then that would be a subset of everybody in the county. Or maybe it's political leaders that you need to implement a certain solution, or focusing on the call to action and then figuring out who are the people in the county who actually are likely to do that call to action and make them the primary audience or even secondary audience, because maybe you can ladder it up again to a more precise audience and then make a tertiary audience of, quote unquote, everybody in the county.
Thank you.
Welcome. There's a question in the chat. Do you have suggestions on how to start the process of creating relationships with journalists? Is there value in setting up a coffee meeting to introduce yourself, or is it enough to dive right into sending emails, RE events, and projects? I think both are valuable and depend on how you want to approach it. It's an art form, not a science. If you're in a rural area where there are 1 to 3 journalists that are valuable to reach out to, I would do both. I would start sending them emails about projects, but then also say, I'm so-and-so, I work at such and such, we do X, Y, Z. These are the kinds of stories we're hoping to talk to you about. Do you want me to just start sending you stories? What's the best way to send you stories? When are your deadlines? Like, when are your publication dates? Would you like to get together and talk about it? Or should I just start sending you ideas? So it's going to be as individual as you and as individual as the journalist, but all of the above are okay as long as you're just approaching it as a relationship like any other. And honestly, since you aren't actual, PR professionals, you're authentic people doing work in your, I'm saying I'm not an authentic person, basically, but you are a person doing, actual on the ground work, and it's not going to feel managed if you just reach out to the journalists. I think the best way, and also you might not know who to reach. Maybe it's you contact everybody at a local newspaper and say, I'm not sure who the right person is, but this is the kind of story, these are the kinds of stories we have. Who do you recommend I reach out to? I do that a lot.
Yeah, I have another question. I first just wanted to say this has been really helpful information and really great because I work in the environmental field. And so we actually don't have PR professionals on staff, and it falls to folks who maybe are somewhat trained in communications. So this has been really great. My next question is, so regarding environmental work, oftentimes we don't have a lot of hours outlined to do this type of work. My job might be a lot of different things, and this is one piece of it. Do you have any ballpark range of amount? I know this is a hard question, but amount of hours or amount of time that doing a good level, just a basic level would take? Or is that so dependent on the organization that it's kind of hard to get an answer? But that's my question, because I'm doing some work planning. So this is kind of a self-serving question right now.
I do think it's really individual, but I think if you could spend, a couple days planning per year, and then look at the things you want to do and how much time you think that would take you, that would be a good way to get a handle on hours. I think that social media, people think it takes a lot of time, but it doesn't have to. If you're very targeted and focused, you can do it in certainly less than an hour a week. Maybe it's an hour every 2 weeks if you're wanting to be consistent but not overwhelm yourself. And if you focus on the channels that you really think are worthwhile, you can make it as little or as much as you want. And you could start small the first year and then see how long it took you and go bigger the next year. If you get some success, maybe you'll, have something to show people, to convince the powers that be that you need more resources, that this is working.
That's great. That's actually really helpful to give me a ballpark, because I think sometimes when you're starting this work, it can feel so big and overwhelming that it's hard to know where to jump in. So I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Just focus in on one thing is my best advice for that. Yes, Kellen.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, Tiffany. I relate with that quite a bit. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the thought leadership piece on the slide. I don't remember the context of that. And so I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit more.
Sure. The thought leadership part it's a tactic that would cover, it's even maybe a strategy that can cover a lot of different tactics. And if your organization has a particular expertise in your area, I think that, are you with a soil and water conservation district or a watershed council?
I am not, with a nonprofit, Wetlands Conservancy.
Oh, okay. So you're statewide and your unique expertise is wetlands. And I'm familiar with your organization. If you've had a lot of success over the years in showing the value of wetlands and what people can do to protect them and working across a lot of different jurisdictions. So I would say that the first point is to figure out what your unique value is in, communication space, in sort of the airspace of messaging and different organizations that are communicating different things. So if your unique value is wetlands, thinking about, are there specific messages that we want to get out? And if so, who and how? Are there board members that are particularly well-spoken or really want to be out in their community giving speeches, or maybe they use social media a lot so they can develop thought leadership for your organization? Your executive director is, of course, also a potential source, but it really depends on the person. So maybe the director isn't the right person, but ideally there's somebody at your organization that can be a spokesperson and that can help develop that unique message that shows, we're the Wetlands Conservancy, we are the experts at blank. There's a question in the chat about SWCDs and public records laws, and I'm actually not familiar with what kinds of public records laws are challenging for conservation districts to deal with on social media. Holly, if you're there, do you want to tell me more about your question? Does anyone else with a SWCD have more perspective on that?
There are archiving, Alex just posted in the chat, there are archiving services that we're looking into that can help with public records.
Oh, it's because the posts basically disappear.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, it can get complicated just because of, legally protected speech. And, if you have an ongoing conversation, or you have a blog post and somebody says something. I just was curious if you have run into that at all with some of the organizations that you work with. I have, who Alex Yeah, I've heard of the archiving services, and I'd be curious if Alex, what you find out, and maybe send that around to folks, because it can get some complicated issues can come up around free speech and some of the interactions that happen, whether it's from internally in the organization or, just externally through posts and so on.
And is that because, are the district managers elected?
Yes, there are concerns around posting information for elections, and if there's any kind of controversy around that, or there's also just the fact that we're a government district, and so everything becomes public record. And with social media, people can leave a post, someone can reply to the post, and the original can disappear. Their account could get deleted, or they could delete their own comment. And so requests for those records become, it can be difficult to produce everything that could get asked for. And so archiving services could cover your bases, because they do pretty much instantaneous capturing of anything that happens across all your channels. So that's something we're probably about to get started ourselves, and I could let you know our experience. And there's some pretty simple rules you can find. I think it's on the Secretary of State page about social media records and rules.
We do have social media, a policy and procedure for it, but there's some gray area, and it can get very complicated. And our board of directors are elected officials, so there's that. But there are, certain things that district staff have to abide by, and we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of that. I just was curious, as communications professionals, if you had dealt with more of the social media posting and blogging and the interactions that can come up, or even on webinars. I've seen it was a local watershed council, but they had someone attend the webinar that was extremely rude and intrusive, and just saying things that were really surprising, and how you manage that in real time,
right?
As a district versus a council. So anyway,
that's a concern. People can leave offensive or racist or whatever kinds of comments. Social media is completely open to that risk. So
right. It's an interesting challenge in today's world.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I've noticed that recently with Facebook, at least, it's really interesting. Like, I know you can hide comments, and that's not always the best, and deleting and so forth. And usually it's best to kind of let people just fizzle themselves out. Engaging isn't the best option, because it just adds more credibility to their claim, because you're acknowledging them. But recently I've noticed that Facebook does only showing relevant comments. So it's really interesting. It's not something I do. It is what the algorithm does. And so if a lot of folks are more engaging with the post of hey, I support this, this is great, this is awesome, or the general message of the social copy, then it shows. But then if I want to view all the comments, which a lot of times the negative ones actually kind of get hidden, I have to click view all, and then that's when it shows up. So that's been an interesting platform, and it's kind of nice in a way, because then I don't feel like a lot of folks see it, but then I don't have to feel like I have to delete it or remove it. But it is an interesting shift that I've noticed recently on Facebook, at least.
Yeah, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they all have similar things. Like Twitter, if someone engages in a lot of trollish replies, they'll often get hidden in the view more replies, and they won't show by default. So the sites themselves are taking some steps around that.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments or challenges?
Hopefully that means we did a good job.
I've got another one. So I'm new, I'm not a communications professional by training, and so very new to this. This has been very, very helpful. Thank you. I'm curious, it seems like this communications plan is much more broad. It's like your organization as a whole. But what about when you have sort of a major milestone, like we just conserved a new wetland? Would you create a strategic communications plan around just that project? Like when do you, I mean, obviously you have one for your organization, but then how do you determine what effort deserves this plan, this level of effort?
Yes, good question. I think that about the first half of this process can be useful as a baseline for any campaign type communications you have or specific moments in time that you need to communicate, because it's going to be valuable to see what are our strengths, right? What can we lean on to do our best here? Who are the audiences we're trying to reach? Most likely, whatever audience you're trying to reach for that campaign is one of the audiences you've already thought about generally for your organization. It might not be, it might be a little different, it might be slightly new kind of, anomaly, but usually it is one of those audiences you've already thought about. So getting a sense of who those audiences are, where they like to get their information, what kinds of things you would like them to know, and what kinds of things you would like them to do will all be really good baseline work for then deciding, okay, we conserved a new wetland. And frankly, that's something that your organization does not infrequently, right? So that will be something you'll need to communicate throughout, multiple times throughout the year. So it would be good to know when we conserve a wetland, who are the audiences we're trying to reach? What do we want them to know? What do we want them to think? What do we want them to do? Do we want them to tell the world? Do we want them to thank their elected officials? Do we want them to donate money? Having a good sense of that will help you for those times when you have a specific project. And then if you have a new sort of unusual thing to communicate, again, you can go back and see, are these audiences we've already thought about, that is there information we've already thought about that we can build from?
Thank you.
Kelsey wants to know if we have any tools we can share for calendaring and content planning. We can share some examples. I don't think we have
And a bit before that, Renee asked, do we have any recommendations or guide for social media best practices and developing strategy?
That's also a good question. Okay, for calendaring and content planning, the cheapest is something like a Google Sheet, where multiple people can contribute to it, and you can plan out months and things like that. It's also really handy to, if you decide to do a decent amount of this, to sign up for, Hootsuite or Sprout Social or something like that. And I know those cost money. Some are more expensive than others. Some aren't that expensive, especially if you're only posting to one platform, and can make the timing a lot easier so that you only spend a half hour every Monday sort of scheduling some content. But I know that's not always possible. So a Google Sheet can be useful. In terms of policies, we have probably some examples of social media policies that we could scrub and share. But I guess, do you want to talk more about that, Noreen?
Yeah, I think with sorry, I just want to make sure I'm getting the full question. So with policy and strategy, I think it's really great to assemble the team who will be in charge of that. So responding and just like executives, and talk to them about like, hey, how do we want to interact with our audience? Do we want to respond to every comment? Do you want to just respond to certain ones that are like questions? Are we going to react? I think those are good to get out of the way. And then so with more positive notes, but then also looking at how do you want to respond if there's negative? So if you are able to, like if you do feel the need, like you want to delete comments or you're legally able to, then what's the threshold for that? And obviously you can't predict every situation, but it's like, hey, if they're saying really offensive, rude things, or this is starting to devolve into something, then we can remove it. But for the most part, we'll just hide it, or we're just going to let it fizzle out and not do anything. So it's good to address those early on. And of course, they can kind of come up just as like any goals and any plans, they can be adjustable. So if you notice there's a certain type of content that keeps coming through with certain folks, I've definitely talked to clients where it's like, hey, we're getting this consistent person who's like, yeah, a Twitter troll that's constantly coming, and it's now they're interacting with folks who are just trying to support the organization. So it's like, it's not becoming beneficial, it's kind of becoming a hindrance. So I'm just gonna block this person. And after having blocked that person, the social media feed is much better. So bringing up those conversations and seeing it in that instance, but we didn't know ahead of time, like, hey, we would want to block someone. We kind of let it sit for a few months. We're like, we're just going to ignore. So I think it's really great to figure out who's going to be responding and managing the social media, and then figure out the policies from there. And just like best practices in general, I would say I really think posting consistently, not too much because you don't want to overwhelm folks, but with the algorithms now, it's not really chronological. So you really just want to get in folks' feed. And anything with like an image or a link or video works best. Plain text can work if you're trying to get a message out really quickly, but if you're able to quickly just post a photo, even if it's not super relevant, like, hey, we have an event, and have a photo from like the last event, totally fine, or something else. That tends to get more engagement than just posting just text. So that's my general overview for social media.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions about story mining or understand what I was saying about that? Or we were saying about that?
Yeah, I think it'd be great if you could go into more detail. For me, I've just let staff know that if they ever have something fun to share about the organization, just to email me photos and a narrative. But I'm wondering, like, what is the deeper, I'm sure story mining is more than that. If you could give a little more detail on that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yes, it starts with that, with what you were talking about. And then what I recommend is that it's a little bit time, it can be a little bit time consuming, but I think the most valuable is if you actually set up meetings with a few key people every quarter. You don't have to do it forever, because you'll find that eventually they'll start coming to you and they'll say, they'll be thinking about it. You'll have asked them the question, 4 times a year. Hey, what did you do this quarter that was interesting, or what's coming up next quarter? And then they'll start to realize what kinds of things you're interested in. It also just puts you in front of them where when something happens in between the meetings, they are more likely to remember to reach out to you and to incorporate it into their thinking about a project, or into their thinking about a work. How does my work overlap with communications? So that can be really useful. If that's not possible, because meeting with someone once a quarter can get pushed off, or other priorities happen, then I think a regular email or phone, quick phone call, just checking in and asking what's going on, what do you have planned, what do you think, have you thought about anything for the social channels, that sort of thing. Yeah, an email can suffice in a pinch. You just want to be constantly reminding people, hey, I need help with communications, can't do communications in a vacuum. All of you are responsible for supporting the storytelling side of it. And here I am, and here I am again, and here I am again.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, and if you have the time and resources, like if you're story mining for news releases or communications, really thinking about, like, for myself, since I do a lot of work with social media, so looking into how we can repurpose it. So we're not going to usually post out the press release, but then, okay, maybe we can break this up. Or if you're sending out a newsletter with one of the organizations I'm working with, like, I decided like, hey, how about we break out the newsletter content for social media? So we're not posting just the whole PDF and people can scroll through it if they feel like it, but oh, there's cool graphics and images with everything. So, okay, here's this blurb about this event and here's the picture. Here's this updated fact or stat. So it's really great if you do, they all kind of tie together. So if you have one communications material that you're using, it can be repurposed elsewhere. So it's kind of good to put on your hat and think about the other angles that are there too.
One of the Kelseys says, and when colleagues share content that performs really well on social, we circle back and let them know how many likes it got, et cetera. So hopefully they're excited or inspired to share more. Yeah, that's smart.
Yeah, definitely tagging folks is great and getting engagement for cross platforms or cross networks and sharing back and forth. Sometimes it becomes like a thanking cycle where it's like, thank you for all the great work that you're doing. No, thank you for sharing. And it's just like, yeah, thanks for also responding. But I think that's also great because it shows that there's like a human behind the keyboard in the organization. So people want to engage, and if they feel like they'll get recognized, then of course that continues the cycle that more folks will engage as well.
Yes. And it's okay to post something and then tell all your employees or board members or both, hey, we have this post on Facebook. I think you're going to enjoy it. Please go like it. Please go share it. Don't do it with every post, but it's okay to ask people and remind people, look, you're part of our organization. This is one of our expectations. Our expectation is that occasionally you will engage with us on social media. If you're on social media. I just say that because I know some board members in your area will be like, I am never getting a Facebook account.
Really quick, I'm curious if you guys have seen organizations like similar to SWCDs or government go on TikTok yet. I have been kind of like curious about that because I know that personally I find it's an engaging platform, but I don't know like where other organizations, I don't want to make one if that's not, I have to actually get approval. But long story short, my question is, what kind of organizations do you see on there right now?
And that's even a hard one for me because I'm not a Gen Zer, I'm a millennial, but I feel TikTok is definitely, a lot of organizations are trying to be on there, but I don't find I think you can suffice with your markets. Is like a lot of times like Facebook is a really good one because it seems like that was the big one and a lot of folks have been on there, and I feel like that's a really engaging one. But TikTok, I find you have to be really on the trends and be really like with it to do so and be able to create those video content, whereas like it might be a bit easier with Facebook to post like more still images. So I haven't seen much of TikTok. Even some of even with news outlets and stuff are now trying to be on there as well too. It's just not as I don't think it's as successful, or it's like if you're trying to reach younger markets that way, and I know other folks are on there too, but it's still a lot to be learned about. And I feel like it might be too much of an investment. Like I don't like if you wanted to spend all your money on Google Plus and focus on that, but that did not pan out if anybody remembers that platform. So I think TikTok is definitely something that is really cool. It's helpful, but like a lot of TikToks get shared on Instagram, and then Instagram Reels get shared on TikTok. So those can translate over. So I feel if you want to trial doing like video content and being more like quick short clips, I think Instagram Reels would be a better resource to do so. And then if you hear through the grapevine that TikTok is where a lot of folks are, you start seeing organizations you want to partner with on there, then you can try to dip into it. But I wouldn't like go all in or try to like look at it. We're not really doing any TikTok for our clients, and I keep seeing it as webinars to learn about, but it just doesn't really feel like something that seems that we need to. The main four I try to focus on are Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. And some people don't need to be on all four, but those are the big four. And then I was seeing Chris's comment
I just had a real
about,
quick follow-up on that. I think they're mostly still just for big brands and influencers. So, but again, if you do the legwork of the communications plan, you know, TikTok's a tactic. So if you do the research and you do the SWOT analysis and you figure out a strategy, then it will be clear. Does TikTok make sense?
That makes sense. That kind of fits with what my perspective has been. I see a lot of science educators and kind of influencers and big companies, and it kind of feels like the market for my particular organization isn't there, and we don't have the staff time, which is my coworker just said that in the chat, which is true. But I was curious what your perspective was on that. So thanks for sharing.
I think she's right. Yeah. So if we choose not to participate in social, what's the next best thing? First, I think it's to get the social channels and just direct people to wherever you are, direct people to your website, but secure those social channels so if people are looking for you on Facebook, they know where to go to find information. But yeah, I would think your website would be the next best. Noreen, do you agree?
I agree with that too. And I think a newsletter is also great as well. So Alexa posted that. And so I think that's just a great overview for, yeah, sending out an email newsletter, or if you want to do print. But I think email is pretty great and dynamic that you can link to people everywhere and it just gives them an overview. Yeah, I think, yeah, website, online. It seems like you would have to be online at some point or have some digital component. I don't think that you could not have a website, not have an email newsletter, and not have social media. So you'd have to have at least a little bit of technology in there since 21st century and all.
A phone number?
Yeah.
Well, we're hitting up right close to noon, so can probably wrap up unless there's another question. And oh, there's some more thoughts on TikTok in the
That's a good
chat.
idea.
But
yeah.
Any closing thoughts?
I have on our list that we will send the template to Kelsey to send out, and then we'll probably take a little longer, but we can send something that we've used before, like a Google Sheet template of sorts that we've used before for social media, and maybe an example of an organization's social media policies. And I imagine Colt has one. Maybe you can, if you're willing, you could also share that as an example.
Yeah, definitely. And I will also share this recording too to refer back to, and it'll be available on the Oregon Conservation Partnership website in the next couple of days. So thank you, everyone, and huge thank you to Natalie and Noreen for sharing your expertise with us today.
Yeah, and I just put my email in the chat too, if anyone wants to follow up directly with questions or anything. It's on our website too.
Have a good rest of your day.
LinkedIn, if you want to find me there. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
me
you.
too.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.